Hey everybody, I'm Francesca Maxime. Thanks so much for joining us for this edition of Rerooted, where we really invite you to discover your own inner wisdom and where you're rooted, not only to yourself, but actually to the land that you're on. Like right now, I'm on Lenape land. This is indigenous land that happens to be now known as Brooklyn. And I hail from many different places. Ancestors from Africa, through Haiti, through Chicago to Boston and then New York. And on the Italian side, you know, all of my folks over there came many moons ago. And then, of course, my Dominican side, which is a whole other story of being this mixed ethnicity mashup. And so that's what I carry. And that's what I'm bringing into this conversation today a little bit. And I'd invite you to explore what you carry and see if you can do it without any kind of judgment or, you know, kind of good or bad or right or wrong, but just that mindful approach of bringing attention to the present moment. And as you listen to our conversation with the guest I'm going to introduce in a moment, I would just invite you to sort of think about, what's happening in my body as we're talking about this or as I'm listening to this? Where am I getting tight? Where do I want to check out? Do I want to press pause? Do I want to jump out? Do I want to fight? What do I want to do? And see if we can just notice that and get curious about it as we go along. I promise it's not going to be too painful. It's just a podcast, but it is an invitation and an exploration of something that the guest today, Patti Digh, D-I-G-H, calls Hard Conversations, an Introduction to Racism. It's a course that she offers online that I've taken, which I really found to be so helpful. And it's just really doing the work of racism, really understanding where this comes from. It's a month-long online seminar program hosted by authors, speakers, and social justice activists, Patti Digh and Victor Lee Lewis. It was featured in the film The Color of Fear, with help from a community of people who want and are willing to help us understand the reality of racism by telling their stories and sharing their resources. So without further ado, Patti Digh.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure. Thank you for doing this kind of work. And for those who aren't watching the video and who are just listening, Patti, how would you self-identify?
I would identify as a very white woman of a certain age. I am Southern, raised Southern Baptist, so that's in my background, and I bring all that forward with me. I would identify as a social justice educator more than anything else. Excuse me, and as a writer around these issues.
Beautiful. So, so for all of that, this is work you've been doing for 30 years. It's been a long time going, and you've been offering this online class for the last 4 or 5 years. So talk to me a little bit about what got you into starting to do work around social justice and undoing racism.
I think there are two main influences from my life. One was I was an exchange student to Sri Lanka from this very small southern town that I lived in with not very much racial diversity at all. And I end up living with a Sinhalese family, a Buddhist family in Sri Lanka. And there was just some sort of opening. I had never even been on an airplane before, so it wasn't that I had experienced any part of the world. And here I find myself with a group of people who are vastly unlike me in terms of how we look. And we had so much in common. I was 16 years old and had no fear of being in this different culture, and took away from that a lot of things that I thought about, not only about the people that I lived with, but about religion, because as I said before, I was raised Southern Baptist, and here I am studying with Buddhist monks and really looking at a very much broader sense of the world and ourselves in it. And then the second thing was that I went to a Quaker college when I started college, and I fell in love with a Black man who was this amazing and is this amazing human being. And my parents disowned me as a result of that whole process. So that...
What year was that?
That was 1978. Yeah, 1978. And we were the victims of quite a bit of name calling and spitting and violence in Greensboro, where we were living. And we actually were there during the Greensboro massacre, in which the KKK killed 5 people in daylight in downtown Greensboro. So
Mm.
it was a dangerous time to be in this relationship, and I found myself unmoored in a way because my family, said that we can't accept this. That was a big education for me. I was 18, 19 years old, and really beginning to see the impact of racism on a very personal level, and certainly the impact that it had on my boyfriend. My parents never met him, so it was all an abstraction for them.
Mm.
So that had a profound personal impact on me and on the work that I do in the world. I wanted to make sure that that doesn't happen, frankly, and educate people. I realized at the time when I started this Hard Conversations online class that I could either be really angry about these issues or I could try and educate people around them. And so I chose to try and educate people. And certainly it's tough when you add on the layers of parents and family and all that's associated with that and the violence that we were facing in Greensboro. It was a pretty important time in my life, and has a direct impact on the work that I do.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Really moving story. And I'm so glad that you shared it, because I really think it puts in place the framework for your dedication, your passion, and really, the seed that was planted early on that is continuing to grow and flower and benefit with all kinds of different fruit. So thank you for that. On a personal note, I know also my grandparents weren't all thrilled when my mom, was with my father as a Haitian and Dominican man with brown skin. And
Mhm.
it was interesting because in that case, things didn't work out, not because of his skin color, but because of his own, sort of trauma and conditioning and personality that wasn't a good long-term fit. But it was interesting that once I was brought home, my grandparents did still embrace me and were willing to raise me. So I am forever grateful for that.
It's interesting when you say that it wasn't the skin color, that there were other pieces. I think as a young adult, trying to tease out whether it is race that is causing the split or not. I'm not with that boyfriend anymore. It was a college romance. But it took me a long time to really try and make sure I'm not choosing the easy route here just because this is really hard. And
What do you
so,
mean by that?
in terms of extending a relationship that might have ended sooner, really trying to suss out, am I breaking up with this person because it's time for us to break up? Or am I breaking up with this person because this is just too hard?
Right.
Not being in touch with my family, and my father died in the middle of all that, and my mom said I killed him, and
Oh,
there was
wow.
a lot of stuff that went on, and so I think that's something for us to think about, is the ways in which the overlay of race really have an impact on what decisions you're making and when you make them. It was harder for me to break up with him than it would have been otherwise, because I wanted to make sure I'm not doing this because it's a tough situation. I'm doing this because of conditioning that he has, or that it's not
Yeah.
a good fit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm so glad that you're emphasizing that distinction, right? Because we can't just say, well then all of, these are the words we want to be careful with, right? All, never, always, none, whatever, right? So like all people of color are just perfect, or all white people are horrible, or all, like what?
Yeah.
No, this is not that conversation. This is about everybody's an individual, unique, right? And has their own imprinting from whatever, ancestrally, intergenerationally, personal, situations. So, and they may also come into the world with a particular skin color that may or may not
Right.
predispose, them to a variety of other situations. So thank you for that. So moving ahead then from that place in the beginning, Talk to me about, why did you end up starting this class? Because you had been doing this work for 2 decades. This online class that you offer for a month, it's about $100. It's, relatively affordable. And who is it for? Who would take it? Excuse me. And what could they expect in it?
The reason I started it was born out of what a friend of mine called my summer of rage, the summer of 2015, which was really sparked by the Charleston massacre. And what happened after that, I first felt a sense of despair because I had been doing the work for 30 years, and here we were, in the summer of 2015, and this is still happening. But I got angry, and I got angry in a pretty unproductive way with people who were on my Facebook page, for example, who were saying I'm colorblind, or all the things that I've heard all through my life that have irritated me. They just erupted in rage in that summer. And I decided at one point that this was not healthy for me, which in fact it was not, but that I could either continue to be angry and lash out at people for being ignorant, or I could try and teach them. And so it was an amazing summer for me, of sitting down and saying, okay, what would I teach people? What would I have them know and understand and see differently as a result of taking this class? So I set up 4 weeks of class. The first week is around structural racism. I really wanted white people in particular to understand the history of racism in this country, the fact that we're founded on racist principles. And I really wanted folks in the class to be overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the issue in that first week, which they are. Every time I teach the class, there's wait a minute, hold on, this is too much. It's too much information. Mm-hmm. I really designed it to be too much information, to be overwhelming in a pretty significant way.
And can we just pause there for a moment and, from your view, define racism?
Oh, racism for me is all about structural and systemic systems that have been put into place to keep people of color in a certain place in the society. And while I'm interested in individual prejudices and implicit bias and that sort of thing, I'm most interested in the systemic and structural ways in which we perpetuate this system of white supremacy over people of color. And so that first week is all about that. It's giving example after example in different fields: education, housing, you name it, the criminal justice system. And then that week is followed up with a week on white privilege, which is, as you know, a term that sparks all kinds of reaction from white people in particular. But we really look at what is the system of privilege that we inherit and that we live under and that we benefit from, and how can we use that white privilege to end the very system of white privilege that it comes out of. So white privilege and white fragility is the focus for the second week, really diving into that and understanding and seeing how it plays out in the class. I mean, I think what happens in this class is what happens when I do face-to-face work, and that is very early on, white people will stand up and say, well, we need to do something about this. We have to do something about this. And the response that I always have is, no, you actually need to sit in racialized discomfort for a little while. You need to feel the discomfort of this in order to make good decisions about what you're going to do about it, which is not a popular response necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
because I think we want to go right to problem solving. And I talk in the class about how problem solving is not the highest form of engagement that we can have, and yet we stop there a lot of times. So the white fragility and white privilege week is a week that sparks all kinds of conversations about shame and guilt and frankly, emotions that do nothing to help people of color. So I like to have people sit in that muck for a while and get past the idea that their feelings have to be tended to in order for them to see what work needs to be done. The third week is the myth of color blindness, because I hear this from a lot of people. Oh, I'm not prejudiced, I'm colorblind. So I did a series of, I think, really powerful interviews for all the weeks. But in this week in particular, there were two young men that I interviewed that I think really got at what happens when you say you're colorblind, two men of color. And then the fourth,
Colorblind, a person saying that I don't see color. It doesn't matter if you're black or white or anything else in between.
right.
What is that?
It's a negation of who they are, first of all. First, it's a lie, because physiologically you do see color. I think what happens is we confuse noticing difference with making a judgment. And so we want to pretend we don't see difference because that means that we're making a judgment. And we have to tease apart those two things. That I can notice difference without making a judgment.
And I just want to pause there for a moment and just underscore for listeners, because many of whom are listening are friends of the Be Here Now Network. And this is a collection of mindfulness and spirituality-based podcasts. And, this podcast is sort of extending that into applied mindfulness is what I like to call it. How do we, once we learn that we can observe without judging, then what do we do? So it's not about problem solving. It's about discernment and about wisdom and wise action. And you started by saying that when you were in Sri Lanka, were with these Buddhist monks, and, obviously you understood, and with this Quaker perspective also from college, what it's like to have not just the kindness and compassion component, which is critical, but also to have this, this awareness and this separation of the awareness and then checking in on how do I feel about this. So as this applies to skin color with color blindness, we're saying, actually notice this person is constructed in a certain way. It may or may not be the same as me. And whether or not I have a feeling about that, am I spiritually bypassing, so to speak, by saying, oh, I'm colorblind, by jumping to, oh, I don't see color. I just treat you the same as I would treat anyone.
Right.
And as you said, that negates their own uniqueness, whatever that is, because it's physiologically also incorrect, and also kind of takes off the table like anything that they might have experienced that might have been negatively impacting them or their lives or their ancestors based on the color of their skin. So as you said earlier, that individual lens as opposed to that, sort of more structural lens. So I just wanted to put a pause there and just sort of recognize that this is what mindfulness in action looks like, is what you're asking right now.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And I do think my Buddhist study and my study in the Quaker College have a lot to do with how I approach this work, for sure. So I have not had anybody point that out before. So thank you.
Well, it's just the way I see it, because it's the present moment attention to what's actually here without judging it, right? And without clinging to it, pushing it away, or zoning out about it.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's ignorance and you're zoning out and you don't want to see it, and that's what colorblindness is, and that's what the Buddha says is the root of, suffering, which is, not being able to see clearly. And colorblindness in that way is, well, you're maybe not acknowledging or seeing clearly what's actually here.
And yet, I think you are, and you're denying it. It's an interesting, because the discomfort is too real, and the fact that I would have to face my own bias about this person based on skin color, for example. That's hard for us to do, and I think sitting in this discomfort is really hard for us to do as well.
Yeah.
One, we're rewarded in this culture for forging ahead and solving things. But two, I think this question that I raised earlier really is the crux of it. And that is, can I notice difference without making a judgment in my head or out loud? Either one.
Or even notice that there's a judgment arising, but have the awareness to notice that there is a judgment around it.
Right.
Right. So like there's this thing that I'm noticing, then there's the way I feel about it, which in, mindfulness or Buddhist terms, they would call the Vedana, the feeling tone, how you're, what's the quality of the thing that you're noticing, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral or whatever, and aversive energy or clinging energy. Right. And then there's the next step, right, of kind of what do I do? But if you can be with those, if you can check those out, there's the thing, there's how I feel about the thing. None of those are me. None of those are the thing. They're just other steps, right? They're little chunks on the train. And then what happens?
Yeah.
Then it kind of can get interesting or curious, about what's next for possibility, I think.
Yeah, and I think curiosity is a great word for it. How can I live in a spirit of curiosity, as opposed to judgment, becomes an important question.
Yeah.
Around this work.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry, I interrupted you, but keep on.
I don't remember what I was talking about.
Well, you were on your class weeks. And so we were talking about white privilege and white fragility and those terms, and people getting stuck in a shame spiral or feeling as though their feelings are needing to be tended to. And then you're going to go to the next step.
Yeah. So colorblindness is the third week. And the last week is how to be an effective ally. It's what's the ask? What are people of color asking for us to do? And what do we need to do and want to do around these issues? What's helpful and what's not helpful? What's right helpfulness around this issue, I think, is the question. And so we explore what that is. And also we explore, how do I maintain this focus over a period of time? Because as you know, this is not a 4-week, okay, now I've done it, and now I'm educated and I am skilled enough to go out and change the world. It's really an ongoing process of education. So how do I maintain the focus that I have around these issues? What's the why for it in me? And that's how we end the class. And we also end in the last call that we have with a moment for folks to say, this is the next step I'm going to take. Because I think it's easy to say, oh, I'm going to go out and I'm going to change my whole community. But that's a great thing to aim for. But what's that first step that you're going to take? What's the really manageable, even small step that will take you in that direction? And I think we have to start there. That's my impression.
Yeah, and one of the Dharma teachers at New York Insight that I, would often learn from, Gina Sharp. I remember a few years ago when she was teaching heavily there, she was asking, so what can you do? What can you do? Right. And at the time, before I started doing some of this work, I really didn't have a good answer because I was also sort of in the dark. And I really didn't know what I didn't know, even though I have this mixed ethnic background, even though I have been the subject of microaggressions and I have all this intersectionality in terms that even some of our listeners may not totally be familiar with, but it just means that there's a lot of different things happening. It's not just a monolithic identity, really. It means that I'm Haitian, Dominican, and Italian. It means that I'm a minority, and it means that I'm also have a lot of white skin privilege. It means that I have an Ivy League education, and it means that I grew up with a working class mindset and, a variety of different things. And so, anyway, but you were going to say something. Go on.
Oh, I can't remember.
Okay, sorry. I had you mesmerized there for a moment.
You did.
I was hypnotizing you with my multi-ethnic verbosity. So let's just go back then, because I think you've said a lot about how the class is structured. But one of the things that struck my attention is this piece about folks not wanting to sit in the discomfort. So it's sort of what one of my friends calls the newfound wokeness, wants to go out there and be like, whoa, let's change the world. And we're like, no, you need to actually just sit in this, right? Because where is that energy coming from? What's the intention of it? Is it to escape your own pain, or is it to really help others? And you have to really sit with that in order to be able to discern it.
Right. You do.
Yeah. And then learn the tools for self-regulation, which is sort of some of the work I do with folks, so that you can increase your capacity for the discomfort without feeling like you're getting flooded or just, going into quicksand. So from the mindfulness perspective, I think we also look at urge surfing, and we look at, discomfort tolerance, right? Like, how can I, do the thing or be with the thing, but not have to have more of the thing, or none of the thing, right? And so how does that show up in terms of what happens with people when they kind of notice what they've been missing about the history of race in the United States and, 450 years of, frankly, oppression and systemic injustice? What happens when you're inviting them to kind of just sit with it?
I think the first thing that happens is they make a choice about what they do at a hot spot, at an edge. And my take on learning is that anything you do at that hot spot is really valuable. So if your first inclination as you're being exposed to all this is to flee and to run away from it, that's great. It's just really good information for you that that's what your operating system is based on. If your idea of sitting in discomfort is to really sit in it and to immerse yourself in it, that's fantastic too, because that's how you process discomfort. So I try not to demonize what people's response is, but to say any response that you have to this material is a valid, meaningful response. That said, I think my experience says to me that over these years I've been doing this work, both in person and online, the first thing that a lot of white people tend to do is center their own pain around these issues and make that the focus. How could I have not known this? And I'm angry at the fact that I didn't know this. And I think that that's all of these are valid responses, but at some point you have to move past that to really be helpful in the process. And I think, there are a number of people who stay centered, who want their pain or their shame or their advocacy or their allyship to be the center of the equation. And I think that that's a falsehood. It's not the right place for us to sit in this discomfort, if that makes sense. So I try to move people, from that center space to say, this is actually not about you, even though you've created it and you perpetuate it. What we're doing next is not about you. It's about opening, listening more, listening a lot more. And I think operating out of choice and opportunity and not just out of a fix-it mindset, which kind of circumvents or bypasses, as you said, the pain. I think one of the questions that's really powerful for me is to say, who do I want to be in this situation? Who is it that I want to be in this situation and what wants to happen here? And a lot of times what wants to happen here is counterintuitive to the white supremacist way of dealing with anything that gets in their way, which is being very productive and very, get the flip charts out and get the markers out and let's make a plan and let's do a strategic plan. And this is something different from that. This is a complexity, not a complicated problem. And there's a big difference between those two. And when I work with groups or when I have individuals come through the class, I think more often than not, I can see that we're looking at this issue of racism as if it is just a complicated problem. And a complicated problem is solvable. You make a plan and you solve it. A moon launch is a complicated problem. So you can get more expertise on your team and you can solve that. Racism is a complexity, and so it's not solvable in that way. We walk into it in a different way. And part of my goal in doing the work is to get people to walk into it in a different way, to have a different relationship with racism, not just to look at it as a complicated problem to solve, but as something to live into and through. And that's fundamentally a different way of looking.
To live into and through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's just sit with that for a minute. To live into and through racism, not just a problem to solve.
Right.
So that acknowledges the reality of racism.
Mm-hmm.
Pause. And then it also invites inquiry.
Right.
As well as checking around, okay, so here's this whole big puzzle and I'm a piece in it, right? And so how does that How does that play out? And if I bring awareness and intentionality to that, can I have a little more agency in terms of what I'm bringing to my piece of the puzzle?
Right.
And how then that might, like the butterfly's wings, they, influence the, waves else, miles and miles away. How do I influence that?
Mm-hmm.
The system, right? That we're all a part of. I mean, I think that's, we keep using this term white supremacy, and maybe I should ask you to define that from your perspective also, because I think some people are like, white supremacy, that's not, what are you talking about? And they get all, knickers in a knot.
It's the same kind of knicker in the knot syndrome that comes with white privilege and white fragility. I think, once we can identify and speak to and say the words white supremacy, it's clear that the structural racism and systemic racism that we see around us, and this is not something that we can believe in or not believe in because it's fact. It's not a belief system, it's fact. Once we begin to really understand the systems that have been put into place and that continue to be perpetuated to keep whites on top of the system, I think speaking the words white supremacy become very important for us, that we need to name what it is that's happening and that we're complicit in it, that I benefit from it.
Yeah, and I just want to pause there too, because I was taking a class with Joy DeGruy, who is a Black social justice warrior, if you will. And, her point about this, I think, is that it's based on, it's based on superiority. I mean, supremacy, to be superior necessarily, whether it's patriarchy and you're talking about gender, patriarchy as a system really is the parent of racism, if you will.
Yeah.
Right. So it's sort of like concentric bubbles, if you will, because it's the systemic structure of, as Gloria Steinem said, ranking and not linking.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So when we're looking at things so if white is best, anything else is bad or worse. And so I need to maintain that I'm best. Right. So I need to stay whiter so I can stay better. And then that would, from that, fall all these other things of, well, then we have to just have whites only. And of course, we know the Jim Crow laws and we know segregation, and we have to be redlining, which means that we have to keep people out of certain neighborhoods and gerrymandering and, all these things. And they can't inherit wealth or accumulate wealth. And so we're not going to give them home loans and things like that. And I'm just curious about that. We talk a lot in mindfulness and in Buddhism about fear being the root of so many things. Unchecked fear, unaware fear, untolerated internal, sensing of fear. Can you speak to that at all, about how that plays into this white supremacy? What are people so afraid of is going to happen if, like, we all have equity?
Well, they're going to lose their piece of the pie, no matter how large or small that pie is. I mean, Trump, this whole environment that we find ourselves in with Trump as president, the rallies that he holds and the ways in which people respond to him are all fear-based. His whole shtick is fear-based. There's a fear that I'm not going to get what I deserve if we have more people of color in this country, for example. So that's how we get to the place where we have concentration camps at the borders. So we're seeing it played out really writ large at this point in our history, and it has been before and it will be again. But I think we have to pay attention to how did this happen, and how is this fear being unleashed by this tyrant, really? And what is the response of people who are trying to continue to do this work and who are trying to be mindful around the process, and who are not jumping to problem solving necessarily, but walking into this in a different way, not looking to solve this problem, but to have a different relationship with it, to learn from it. I don't know if you know James Carse's work on finite and infinite games, but what he talks about is that we play with our lives either finite or infinite games. In a finite game, we play to win. So there's a winner and a loser, and there are rules to follow, and the game has a beginning and an end, and we play to win that game. So football is a great example of a finite game. And an infinite game we play to learn. And so the whole idea of an infinite game is to keep the game going. So hacky sack is a great example of an infinite game where the whole point is to keep the thing going and to learn from how you're playing and engaging in the game. Americans do very poorly at infinite games. We do much better at finite games, like, Pepsi's slogan, beat Coke, that's a finite game. And so I think to enter into this conversation around race in the largest context that we can put it is to say, I'm going to play an infinite game around this. Whatever happens, I'm going to learn from it and incorporate that learning. And I'm going to keep doing that. So that I'm not demonizing what's happening, but I'm incorporating it in terms of what I'm learning from it. If that makes sense to you, I think that distinction is.
No, I think it's beautiful, and I also often emphasize that things aren't so fixed, that we're all process anyway, and so we're really not. I mean, the delusion, or really, I think the fundamental delusion is that we're anything but process,
Right.
And so people will be like, well, wait, this hair clip is fixed, and I'm like, well, sort of, at this little juncture it kind of is, right? And on the other hand, it's kind of not, right? And that's not to say that plastics like this one don't take 1,000 years to
Disintegrate,
right? You know what I'm saying? So there's that awareness too.
Yeah.
And the reality of that, right? And whether or not the way that this supremacist mindset is also affecting, our home planet, our connection to that which sustains us. The 19th, yesterday, because this is June 20th, 2019 that we're taping this, although it will air later, obviously, was Juneteenth. And a lot of people know what that date is and what it means. A lot of people don't. Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote a book called Between the World and Me, and has written extensively about the case for reparations, spoke for Congress yesterday on this issue, and was told by Mitch McConnell that, nobody here who's alive, has anything to do with what happened in slavery back in the day. And, as a very well-spoken author, he was able to articulate and elucidate very specifically some of the reasons why reparations actually are needed and meaningful. So if you don't mind, take a moment, if you could, to explore a little bit about what Juneteenth is about, why it came into being, and sort of what your thoughts or reflections were on what happened yesterday and in general.
Yeah, I haven't seen the testimony. I've read about it. So I'd be interested to hear your take on the testimony a little bit more.
As you can imagine, it would be. It basically just detailed the case of a lot of the work that you're teaching in the class in terms of, as you said, the facts or the history, and who are the inheritors of, as you said, a system of exploitation, rape, genocide, in the case of not only African Americans, but in indigenous people here in this country, and a host of other egregious behaviors that our country is founded on, frankly, economically.
I did see on Facebook today that Google didn't do a Juneteenth Google Doodle. I don't know if you saw this, and that somebody took it upon themselves to make one on their own. So these are the kind of core constructs that we're looking at as validation of something like a Juneteenth. I don't know if that makes sense, but I started thinking about how what comes into our social media feed is what defines reality to some degree.
And so, just to say, Juneteenth is when slaves found out they were free.
Yeah.
June 19th. I mean.
Yeah.
Now known as Juneteenth.
The Google Doodle was created was a really powerful, or the one that was created for Google, since they didn't deign to do one, was a really powerful image around that. And I have conflicting feelings about how much we put on social media in terms of the knowledge that we have or don't have around these issues. But that's not to say the Google Doodle is an important thing, because it does bring up pieces of history that have been forgotten. Lots of women of color, for example, who are scientists, have been featured in the Google Doodle. I don't know why I'm so fixed on this. I think it's because it's such a visual representation of what we care about or what we know about in this country.
And also for me, it brings in a question of who within Google, who determines such things, never occurred to, or who within Google, who may have had the courage to bring this up as an idea, was shot down.
Yeah. When you think about Independence Day, I mean, I'll be interested to see the Independence Day Google Doodle. So it's not the end all be all in terms of knowing about these issues, but I think we have to look for these kind of hallmarks of what the culture is talking about. And so many people are talking about Fox News, for example. That's become the hallmark for a lot of people around what's going on in this country. And it's dangerous. I think that's a dangerous thing for us to hang our hat on, is looking at this state TV. And I'm going off on a rant a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, I used to work for Fox, so I've reported for them and have had my own experiences there in terms of what and how, as a reporter, I was, being guided in terms of my lines of inquiry and the ways in which I would go about being able to access people that they wanted on the air. At the time, I think Mitt Romney was running for president. And, and also for Sinclair, which is a very conservative, powerful, media group, Tribune also. And so I've worked for a lot of media companies, mass media companies, that have kind of come at things from a certain angle. And, that was something that came out of Roger Ailes, who was the former, now deceased head of Fox News and brainchild. He was Nixon's advisor back in the day, and was really an amazing strategist, but really understood, to go back to this notion of fear, what it was, and kind of could sniff it out in people, kind of could sniff out, like, where are people's, I've heard someone in marketing say, where are their pain points, right? And so, like, kind of feeding that. And then to take that against what Rumi, the poet, would call, fear is the cheapest room in the house. So it's cheap, like, you get your Doritos or your Twinkies or whatever, but ultimately, how nourishing is it? And what's the cost, not only to whomever else, but to you too, long term, right? Do you have the equivalent of diabetes or, cancer or something like that, because that's what you're feeding.
Well, it's interesting, because the number one thing that people talk about when they are asked at the beginning of my class, why are you taking this class? They talk about their fears. And their fears are of not knowing what to do, or not doing the right thing, or not knowing enough, or, there's a lack that they're talking about. And I think that the lack piece of fear is a really powerful grounder for a lot of people. That you asked the question earlier, what are people afraid of? And they're afraid of losing something that has meaning for them, something that has made their lives what their lives are right now, which in many cases is whiteness.
So interesting what you're saying, because when you say, the fear piece, I'm thinking of, well, what if we honored the fear? And to use Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communications, sort of piece, what if we looked into the need, or what's under the fear? And when you said, afraid of losing something, I'm thinking, right, so there's an afraid of losing what you're perceived as holding on to in the first place, which we know we really actually don't have if we really orient toward being processed and not fixed anyway. I mean, we do, in the sense that, yes, you can, like, own a hair clip or a house or a car, and yet at the same time, really, what's in our possession, our actions, our integrity, our character, that we certainly have. When we bring awareness to it, intentionality around that, we can determine more about. But that afraid of losing something, how that can be transformed into, well, what will we gain, right? And sort of what is lost when we are living in the place of, I'm afraid of giving up what I have, as opposed to, I'm opening up to the possibility of how if there were more flow, to use another popular term, I could also be receiving in abundance. But what that would require would be a certain amount of faith that that might be possible. And I feel like whether you're spiritual or religious or whatever it is, that sense of curiosity about possibility and living in the uncertainty and the mystery of whatever that is, even if it's not something that we know to be specific, right? There's no like tit for tat, like, okay, well, if I don't stop holding, if I stop holding and I turn to abundance, then everything will manifest. And yeah, maybe, that's what they say, right? But how do we kind of work the edge of that if we don't just dive in, right?
It's interesting what you're saying, because when I started teaching this class, I wasn't teaching it with Victor Lee Lewis, who has now become my teaching partner. And I named it Hard Conversations, an Introduction to Racism. And when I got in touch with Victor, he kind of turned it on its head a little bit. He said, yes, these are hard conversations, but what you gain from them is so powerful, and what you open yourself up to is so powerful. So, I was all about, this is going to be tough and this is going to be hard to do and we've got to do this work. And he was all about, there's joy in this.
Beautiful.
It was gorgeous. It was really gorgeous. So I had to reframe my own take on what this work is about, because for me it had been hard. There had been pleasures in it and seeing people have ahas, but not to the degree that Victor was saying, which was, this is life-bringing to everyone involved. It's life-bringing to the white people who are trying to do this work. And so we need to really celebrate the joy that comes out of it as well, which I thought was really beautiful.
That is so beautiful. And again, it's making me think of like, okay, so if we're moving away from the fear or from the fear, what are we moving into? Okay, it can be this great morass of, the mystery, so to speak. But really, it's kind of connection, right? Feeling more connected to others and to self. And trusting, to use polyvagal theory and physiology states, which I also talk a fair amount about, is trusting that that's okay, that you're safe there too.
Yeah.
Right. So it's really this business of connection, or as you say, joy, which is just this elan and this joie de vivre, which I feel like so many folks who are so neurotic and they just are lost in their own stuff. I'm just like, whoa.
Yeah, and that you can do serious work like this and be joyful about it. I think that's the other piece for me.
Yeah.
That there is a joy to it, and there are rewards to it. I see the impact that it has on people. So
yeah.
Yeah.
And you don't just offer the online class, you do a bunch of other things. So talk about those camps and writing things and stuff like that you do.
Yeah, I do. I do still do a lot of social justice work inside organizations. So I'll go and train a diversity council for a corporation, for example. Most of my work is experiential, so it's movement oriented and not at all talk oriented. I usually take language away from people in order to reveal things that otherwise wouldn't be revealed. And I also have a camp that I started 7 years ago. It's called Life is a Verb Camp. It's named after one of my books. And it brings together people from around the world to have 4 days together. We talk about and focus on courage, creativity, community, and compassion. And it's a magical place where people come and they make art and they write and they listen to poets. I always have poets as our main speakers because I want to support poets' work in the world and hire them to.
I am a poet. That's why, yeah, I'm saying, come on, I'll go.
Yeah, it's fantastic. We've had amazing people there. We had Naomi Shihab Nye and Ellen Bass one year, and Andrea Gibson, and it's just amazing. Toy Darracott. And so I think poets really teach us how to see the world in a different way. So while there are a lot of people who say, I don't do poetry or I don't like poetry, to be in the presence of someone whose words are so moving and so meaningful is powerful. So I have a bunch of converts to poetry as a result of doing the camp.
Yay, Patti!
Yeah. And I do writing retreats and things like that as well. But my main focus is really the the racism work, and trying to say to myself, what would be the next step there? What would be helpful for people
Yeah.
to learn?
And in the last 5 years that you've been offering the class, what have you noticed in terms of the class? What have you noticed in terms of society? Obviously, there's still egregious structural, as you've said, systemic and increasingly challenging policies for people of African American descent in this country, and also people of any other ethnicity or color that isn't, white and Eurocentric. Tell me a little bit about sort of how this fits into what we're seeing today, how it's different from when you started the class.
I think everything is more pointed today. There's seemingly more danger, even though there's been danger all along, I think, because policies are being changed, and we have concentration camps at our borders, and we're at a pitch. We're at a definite pitch. But I will say, what was really heartening to me when I started this class is I thought maybe 50 of my friends would sign up for the first class, just to support me. And 3,500 people signed up. And what that said to me was, people want to do something, and they want to be involved, and they want to learn. And they're just been looking for places that they can actually do that. So I'm really thankful that there are other online classes that are coming up, that there are many places where you can go and join in this conversation and learn things that might not otherwise cross your radar screen. So we've trained probably 15,000 people so far in the last 4 or 5 years with this class. And I'm heartened by that. I'm heartened by the 75-year-old woman who took the first class and wrote me and said, I'm 75 years old, and this has changed my life. I just wish I had taken it when I was 35. And, there's great, I think, coming from a place with the Charleston massacre where I felt really impotent to do anything about that. It felt great to be able to put something together that people would walk away from changed in some way. And now what we see is the conversation in the classroom takes on a greater urgency because of the policies that are being changed in this country right now, where we see things going. So it's a much more urgent conversation than it was in the beginning.
Right. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and just to also say to the 75-year-old woman too, what isn't taught in the classroom, right? Say, in the public classroom, is you got to find it out, but it's hard to find it out when whatever's put in the canon doesn't include that, right? And so when things are curated in such a way, systemically and structurally across the board, to say, well, these are the best authors, or this is the right history, or I love the Latin phrase that Kip Tiernan, a community organizer and the first founder of the first homeless shelter for women in Boston, used to say, cui bono, all the time. She would say, who's benefiting here? Who's benefiting by structuring the class this way? Who's benefiting by structuring the learning this way? Yeah, and I just wanted to say thank you for that. And any closing thoughts, Bose, as we sort of wind down, about anything we've said today, anything you're doing or have coming up or have done, what you might like, because what's your strong offer?
My strong offer at some point is going to be a summer institute that dives into really the creative process involved in social justice work, because I think we push against things a lot. So we want to do anti-racism work, which is a negative direction of intention and pushing against something. But I want to look at the creativity inherent in doing this work, and how we can use that spark or that energy or that joy or that understanding and knowing and wisdom to create something. So I remember being asked at my alma mater to come do some anti-racism work, and just bristling at the thought of pushing against something as opposed to moving in the direction of creating something. But it's very hard to say what that thing is that we want to create. There's not a nomenclature for that as succinct as anti-racism work. So I'd really like to dive into the ways in which this work plays out in a creative in creative forces. So what am I creating, whether it's art or music or better training or whatever it is, what is the genesis of that next step that we're going to take?
Yeah, beautiful. What's generative and emergent?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's, to use Eugene Gendlin's focusing language, what comes freshly?
Mm-hmm.
What's new?
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. I love that. Patti Digh, I invite everyone to check out her website. It'll be on the links and everything. And I just want to thank you for all you've done, and all that you will be doing.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. I really love what you've brought out in this conversation. So thank you. I've learned a lot.
Thank you. So have I. Take good care.
Thanks.